The chill of the Madrid winter seeped through the cracks in the thick walls of the royal palace of Aranjuez. Isabel Maria Josefa, the only daughter of King Ferdinand of Spain, gazed out from her window at the gardens covered in a thin layer of frost. At 17, her delicate face, framed by dark hair, reflected a maturity beyond her years, forged in the crucible of courtly intrigues. "Your Highness," announced Doña Mercedes, her lady-in-waiting, with a curtsy as deep as the concern in her eyes. "His Majesty the King requests your immediate presence." Isabel felt the weight of those words like a stone upon her shoulders. Audiences with her father never boded well, especially since the monarch's health had been deteriorating day by day, afflicted by a disease the court physicians could not name. The palace corridors seemed endless as she walked, escorted by 2 royal guards, the echo of her footsteps on the marble resounding like an ominous portent. Upon reaching the doors of the royal study, Isabel composed her expression, straightened her posture, and took a deep breath. "Enter," boomed the hoarse voice of the king. The study reeked of illness and the ointments applied to the monarch. Ferdinand VII, once an imposing figure, was wasting away in an armchair by the fireplace. Beside him stood the Prime Minister, Luis González Bravo, and the Duke of Valencia, their expressions unreadable. "My daughter," began the king in a faltering voice, "Spain stands at a crossroads. The European powers question the strength of our monarchy, and the liberals conspire in the shadows." Isabel remained silent, sensing the direction of the conversation. "I have arranged your marriage to the Count of Montpensier, nephew of King Louis-Philippe of France. This alliance will strengthen our position and ensure dynastic continuity." The world seemed to stop around Isabel. The Count of Montpensier, that 42-year-old man, known for his cruelty toward women and his contempt for Spain, the same man who had publicly humiliated his previous wife until she met her demise. "Father, I beseech you to reconsider," Isabel began, barely maintaining her composure. "Silence," thundered the king, triggering a coughing fit. "This is not a proposal, it is a royal command. The agreements are already signed. You will marry in 2 months." Tears threatened to spill from Isabel's eyes, but years of courtly etiquette had taught her to restrain them. "As your Majesty commands," she replied in a barely audible voice. Back in her chambers, Isabel found Mercedes waiting, her face ashen. "Is it true, Your Highness? Will they hand you over to that monster?" whispered the lady, momentarily forgetting protocol. "Spain has always sacrificed its princesses on the altar of diplomacy," Isabel replied bitterly. "But I will not become a silent victim." That very night, Isabel secretly wrote to her cousin Carlos, a captain in the Royal Guard and her confidant since childhood. Raised together in the palace, they shared not only blood, but a friendship that, over the years, had blossomed into a love both knew was impossible. The message was delivered by Lucia, a young servant whose loyalty had been secured with promises of protection for her peasant family. Carlos received the note in the guard barracks. His weathered face, hardened by years of military training, paled as he read its contents. "They sell me like cattle to the French slaughterhouse. 2 months before I become a slave of royal blood. I need your advice, your strength. Tonight at the hunting pavilion." The hunting pavilion was a small building on the edge of the royal gardens, forgotten by the court during the winter months. There, as children, they had shared confidences, and there they met that night under the silver moonlight reflected on the frozen pond. "We could flee," Carlos proposed impulsively. "I have friends at the Portuguese border. We could reach Lisbon and sail to the colonies." Isabel shook her head. "We would be hunted like animals. My father would mobilize the entire army, and even if we escaped, what life would await us? Poverty, perpetual exile. I would prefer a life of hardship by your side to an eternity knowing you suffer under that man's yoke," Carlos replied, taking her hands. "There is another way," Isabel murmured. "The Prime Minister, González Bravo, has always shown a certain fondness for me. If I could convince him that the French marriage is against Spain's interests—" Carlos's jaw tightened. "Would you trust that opportunist? His loyalty shifts with the political winds." "I don't trust him, but I know his ambitions." If I offer him influence in my future government when my father passes. Their conversation stretched into the early hours, plotting plans, weighing risks, and seeking potential allies. Unbeknownst to them, they were not alone in the pavilion. Hidden in the shadows, Joaquin Alvarez, the Duke of Valencia's personal secretary and a spy in the pay of the French embassy, listened to every word with growing interest. The information he had just obtained was worth its weight in gold. The next morning, Isabel was summoned again to the royal study. This time, her father's face radiated barely contained fury. Conspiracy, treason from my own blood. Ferdinand VII spat, slamming his trembling fist on the desk. Before him, the Duke of Valencia held papers that Isabel recognized with horror. Copies of her correspondence with Carlos, including the note from the previous night. Your Majesty, I swear I never… Isabel began, but was cut off by another blow. Silence. The marriage is brought forward. You will wed in 1 week. As for your accomplice, the king paused dramatically. Captain Carlos Bourbon will be immediately dispatched to the Philippines. With luck, the tropical fevers will deal with him. Isabel felt the ground open beneath her feet. 1 week, separated forever from Carlos, delivered to a fate worse than death. You are confined to your chambers until the wedding day, the king decreed. Doña Mercedes will be replaced by the Countess of Teba, who will personally ensure you fulfill your duties as a future wife. The Countess of Teba, a stern woman known for her strict adherence to protocol and unyielding loyalty to the crown, was already waiting at the door. Back in her room, now a prison, Isabel gazed at the wintry landscape with empty eyes. Snow began to fall over the gardens, blanketing the withered hopes of the princess. In her hands, she held a small vial of laudanum, hidden among her belongings months earlier, as if anticipating such a day. The temptation to drink its contents and escape her gilded cage forever had never been stronger. But as she stared at the vial, a steely determination took hold of her spirit. If she was to become a slave, she would not do so meekly. If she was to be queen one day, she would not be a submissive one. The blood of Isabella Throne of Castile ran through her veins, and like her ancestor, she would find a way to forge her own destiny. She tucked the vial away, approached her desk, took up pen and paper, and began to write what appeared to be a farewell letter to Carlos. But hidden between the lines, encoded in a language only they understood from childhood, was a plan. The snow continued to fall relentlessly over Madrid, a silent witness to the gears beginning to turn, the forces set in motion, the threads of fate weaving together to form a tapestry of power, betrayal, and survival. The dawn of the wedding day brought a leaden sky over Madrid. From the window of her carriage, Isabel observed the capital's streets adorned for the occasion with flags and banners that waved limply under the drizzle. The people of Madrid, obliged to celebrate, displayed an enthusiasm as false as the smile Isabel rehearsed each morning before her mirror. The Cathedral of San Isidro gleamed with thousands of candles and flowers brought from Valencia, an opulent display that contrasted starkly with the hunger ravaging the provinces. Isabel, draped in a silk and lace gown that weighed as heavily as her heart, advanced down the central aisle on her father's arm. The king's face, painted to mask his sickly pallor, remained impassive. At the end of the aisle stood Antoine de Montpensier, Count of Orléans, tall and robust, his greying hair and perfectly trimmed beard lending him a distinguished air that belied the rumors of his violent character. Beside him, the French ambassador smiled with satisfaction. The ceremony unfolded like a fevered dream for Isabel. The archbishop's words, the exchange of vows, the ring slipping onto trembling fingers, it all seemed to happen to another princess in another place. Only when the count took her hand with excessive firmness for the ceremonial kiss did the pain snap her back to reality. Their exchanged glance carried a clear message. He would not be a lenient husband. The wedding banquet at the royal palace stretched into the night. Isabel barely touched her food, aware of the gazes fixed upon her, the veiled pity of some courtiers, the calculated indifference of foreign diplomats, the open satisfaction of her enemies. "Smile, my dear," murmured the Count, squeezing her hand under the table until her bones nearly cracked. "Your sadness insults our guests and our nations." Isabel forced a mechanical smile while searching the crowd for Mercedes, who had been relegated to a distant corner of the hall, a constant reminder of the price of loyalty in the Spanish court. The nuptial dance began with a Viennese waltz. As she spun in her husband's arms, Isabel felt his wine-laden breath and veiled threats. "Tonight, you will learn your place, princess. France does not tolerate rebellious queens." When the newlyweds finally retired to their chambers, escorted by a ceremonial procession of nobles to the door of the nuptial suite, Isabel braced herself for the worst. The Count dismissed the maids with a curt gesture. Alone, he transformed. "Undress," he ordered coldly, pouring himself more wine. Trembling but determined not to show fear, Isabel began to unfasten her gown with clumsy fingers. The Count watched her with a mix of desire and contempt. "Do you know why I agreed to this marriage?" he asked suddenly. "It wasn't for your beauty, which is mediocre, nor for your lineage, tainted by your father's weakness. It was for the lands in Valencia and the mines in Asturias that come with your dowry." He approached her, roughly caressing her cheek. "Your body belongs to me now, your will too. You will bear French heirs and act as a devoted wife. Any disobedience will be punished." What followed was etched in Isabel's memory as the first of many nights of humiliation and pain. The Count sought not shared pleasure, nor even selfish satisfaction, but domination, to subdue and break her spirit. When he finally fell asleep, Isabel curled up on the edge of the bed, stifling her sobs in the pillow. Where was Carlos now? Had he received her message? Would he understand what he needed to do? The months that followed established a routine of appearances and suffering. By day, the royal couple fulfilled their protocol duties: diplomatic receptions, inaugurations, solemn masses. Isabel learned to smile while bleeding inwardly, to hold trivial conversations while her mind worked tirelessly, weaving subtle alliances, identifying cracks in her husband's seemingly solid power. By night, in the privacy of their chambers, the Count revealed his true nature. His bursts of violence alternated with long periods of utter indifference. Any pretext sufficed to unleash his wrath. A glance held too long with a courtier, a comment interpreted as defiant, even the tone of her voice when answering his questions. Yet, unbeknownst to the Count, Isabel had begun building her own network of influence. Mercedes, seemingly sidelined, became her eyes and ears in the palace's forgotten corners, where servants spoke freely and secrets flowed like wine. Lucia, now promoted to Isabel's personal maid through Mercedes' intervention, delivered coded messages to a carefully cultivated network of contacts. Merchants discontent with French tariffs, mid-ranking military officers fed up with foreign influence, even clergy members concerned about France's growing anti-clerical tendencies. As for Carlos, news was scarce and contradictory. Some said he had died during the voyage to the Philippines. Others claimed to have seen him in Lisbon. A persistent rumor placed him in the northern mountains, organizing resistance with Carlist groups dissatisfied with the French alliance. Meanwhile, King Ferdinand VII's health deteriorated visibly. The physicians no longer spoke of recovery, but of alleviating pain. The end seemed near, and with it, the moment when Isabel would face the ultimate test, claiming her right to the throne against a husband who clearly aspired to rule in her name. It was amid this tense anticipation that Isabel discovered she was pregnant. The news, which should have been cause for celebration, fell upon her like a sentence. A child of Montpensier meant a permanent bond with her captor, another chain in her gilded prison. "An heir," declared the Count with satisfaction upon hearing the news. "France and Spain united in blood at last. Ensure it is a boy," as if such a thing were in her power, as if her body were merely a vessel for others' dynastic ambitions. The pregnancy, however, granted her an unexpected reprieve. The Count, fearful of harming his heir, moderated his physical excesses. The court, ever eager for hope, began treating Isabel with renewed deference. Even her father, in his increasingly rare moments of lucidity, showed genuine concern for her well-being. "You must be strong, my daughter," he told her during one of his last private visits. A monarch cannot afford the luxury of weakness. I have made that mistake too many times. It was the closest thing to an apology she could expect from that proud, obstinate man, the unwitting architect of her misery. The pregnancy progressed without apparent complications, though Isabel couldn't help but feel deep ambivalence toward the child growing inside her. Could she love the child of a man she despised? Could she separate the innocent from the guilty in her heart? It was in the 6th month when the first signs of trouble appeared. Intense, unexpected pains, bleeding, fever. The court physicians, torn between loyalty to the count and professional duty, diagnosed a threat of premature labor. "Absolute rest, Your Highness," decreed the chief physician, an elderly man who had attended 3 generations of Bourbons. Any emotional distress or physical exertion could precipitate the birth. The count, furious at the possibility of losing his heir, ordered that no one disturb the princess's tranquility. Ironically, this medical order granted Isabel her first period of true peace since her marriage. Confined to her chambers, attended only by Mercedes and Lucia, she could finally reflect and plan without the constant pressure of her husband's gaze. It was during this period of seclusion that the news arrived, whispered by Lucia. Carlos was alive and closer than anyone imagined. The message accompanying this revelation was cryptic but hopeful. The spring brings the thaw. The chains will break when the flowers bloom. Spring, just when her child would be born, just when, according to the physicians, her father would likely draw his last breath. On the night she reached 7 months of pregnancy, Isabel awoke drenched in cold sweat, a searing pain tearing through her womb. Her screams alerted the guard. Within minutes, physicians rushed in, followed by a count both furious and terrified. The labor had begun early. For hours, Isabel battled between life and death as the court held its breath and Madrid's bells tolled, pleading for divine intercession for the mother and heir. At dawn, exhausted, the physicians handed the count a small bundle wrapped in silk blankets. His expression shifted from anticipation to horror, then to utter rage. The child was born with severe malformations. His right arm ended at the elbow, his legs weak and twisted, suggested he would never walk unaided, and his face, marked by a severe cleft lip, defied aristocratic standards of beauty. "This is not an heir," roared the count. "It is an abomination, a curse upon our houses." Isabel, semi-conscious from exhaustion and blood loss, could barely comprehend what was happening. She only knew her child was torn from her arms, that someone wept inconsolably, that there was talk of concealment and shame. When she finally regained full consciousness days later, Mercedes confirmed her fears. The count had ordered the child hidden from the court's sight, confined to the palace's most remote quarters, attended only by wet nurses sworn to secrecy. "He wants to repudiate you," Mercedes explained, her voice breaking. "He has sent emissaries to Rome seeking an annulment, claiming the child's malformations prove you are unfit to bear healthy heirs." Isabel remained silent for a long time, processing the information. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, deeper, more resolute. "Bring me my son," she ordered, "and send a message to our allies. The spring has arrived earlier than expected." The news of King Ferdinand VII's death swept through Madrid like wildfire. Black flags waved over official buildings as bells tolled with monotonous solemnity. In taverns and squares, however, the sentiment was more complex. The monarch who had betrayed liberal hopes, surrendered the country to foreign interests, and ruled with an iron fist, left a legacy of resentment barely masked by official mourning. Isabel received the news in her chambers, where she was slowly recovering from childbirth. Her son, whom she had secretly named Fernando Carlos, against the count's wishes, slept in a crib beside her bed. Against all protocol, Isabel had insisted on keeping the child with her, openly defying Montpensier's orders. "The crown is yours now, Your Majesty," said Mercedes with a deep curtsy, pronouncing the title with deliberate solemnity. Isabel caressed her son's cheek, marked by the cleft lip. In those days, she had discovered a fierce, unconditional love for this small being, rejected by his own father, but perfect in her eyes. "The crown is ours, Mercedes," she replied, "and the time has come to claim it." The state funerals lasted 3 days. Isabel, still weak, presented herself before the court and the people dressed in strict mourning. Beside her, the count maintained an unreadable expression. Rumors of his intent to annul the marriage had already reached the ears of key courtiers, creating a climate of political uncertainty compounded by the void left by the king's death. The royal testament was read in a solemn session of the Council of Ministers. Ferdinand VII, in a final act of clarity or perhaps remorse, had established a shared regency until Isabel reached the age of 21. The Count of Montpensier and the Duke of Valencia would serve as regents with powers limited by a council in which Isabel herself would have a decisive vote. "This is unacceptable," exploded the Count in private, hurling a goblet against the wall. "An insult to France and my dignity." Isabel, seated by the window, observed him with newfound calm. "The testament of a king is sacred, my husband," she replied serenely. "To disobey its provisions would be treason." "You speak to me of treason? You who have borne a monster that taints my lineage," he spat. "The papal emissaries will arrive any moment. Soon you will be but a bad memory in France's history." Isabel rose slowly, facing him for the first time without fear. "Spain is not a French province, Antoine, and I am not a doll you can discard at your pleasure. I am the legitimate queen by divine right, and the blood that runs through my veins." Something in her tone, in the firmness of her gaze, momentarily unsettled the Count. This was not the frightened girl he had married, but a woman transformed by suffering and motherhood. "Your reign will be brief, Isabel," he threatened before leaving, "as brief as the life of that creature you call a son." The veiled threat against young Fernando Carlos ignited a determination in Isabel she hadn't known she possessed. That same night, while the palace slept, she set in motion the long-contemplated plan. Lucia, using her access to the royal kitchens, slipped a potent sedative into the Count's wine. Mercedes, with copies of keys obtained months earlier, opened forgotten passageways connecting the royal quarters to a discreet exit in the gardens. There, by the old ivy-covered well, waited the figure Isabel had dreamed of seeing for so long: Carlos. Their reunion was brief but intense. Words were unnecessary between them. Carlos, leaner and more weathered, a new scar crossing his left cheek, kissed her hand with renewed devotion. "Everything is ready," he informed her in whispers. "The regiments in Valencia and Aragon support us. The British ambassador has promised to recognize your government immediately. The Cadiz merchants have generously funded the operation." Isabel nodded, squeezing his hand tightly. "Have you seen your nephew?" she asked. Carlos's expression softened. "Lucia took me to his chambers before coming here. He is beautiful. He has your eyes." Isabel smiled knowingly. It was true. Little Fernando Carlos had inherited the deep green eyes of her maternal line, a trait absent in the Montpensier. A detail the Count, in his initial rejection, had not noticed, but which might eventually arouse suspicion. The plan was set in motion at dawn. While the Count slept deeply, victim of the sedative, a detachment of the royal guard loyal to Isabel took strategic positions in the palace. Simultaneously, Allied regiments occupied key points in Madrid: ministries, post offices, railway stations. By mid-morning, when the Count awoke, he found himself under house arrest, accused of conspiring against the Spanish crown in collusion with foreign powers. The evidence: compromising documents discovered in his desk, ciphered letters, plans for a coup to deliver vast Spanish territories to France. The documents, of course, were meticulously fabricated, but convincing enough in a climate of growing hostility toward French influence. The Council of Ministers was convened in an emergency session. Isabel, dressed in sober elegance, took her rightful place on the throne for the first time. Beside her, in a decision that would scandalize the court but win the people's hearts, little Fernando Carlos rested in Mercedes' arms. "Gentlemen of the Council," Isabel began with a clear voice, "Spain stands at a historic crossroads. The evidence before you proves a conspiracy that threatens our sovereignty, our independence, and our dignity as a nation." The documents circulated among the ministers. Some faces showed genuine indignation. Others, more seasoned in courtly intrigues, maintained cautious neutrality, assessing which way the winds of power would blow. My husband, the Count of Montpensier, has betrayed not only his queen, but the nation that welcomed him. I propose his immediate expulsion from Spanish territory and the annulment of all agreements signed under his influence. The silence that followed was broken by the Duke of Valencia, who rose with a grave expression. Your Majesty, these accusations are extremely serious and require thorough investigation before such drastic measures are taken. Isabel had anticipated this resistance. The Duke, aligned with French interests, was a key piece she needed to neutralize. Of course, Duke, she conceded with a calculated smile, and that is precisely why I have also ordered a search of your quarters this morning. The Duke's face paled visibly. What was found there, Isabel continued, suggests your loyalty has been divided for far too long. Ciphered letters, payments from the French embassy, detailed reports on our military defenses. Treason, gentlemen, seems to have spread like a plague in this court. The Duke tried to protest, but Isabel raised a hand to silence him. Captain of the Guard, she called firmly. Carlos entered the council chamber, escorted by half a dozen officers. His presence, believed lost in distant lands, caused a stir among the ministers. Arrest the Duke of Valencia for high treason, Isabel ordered, and extend the order to the ministers of finance and navy. Chaos erupted, angry protests, oaths of innocence, even a desperate attempt to flee by the Minister of Navy quickly thwarted. When order was finally restored, only half the original cabinet remained. Gentlemen, Isabel addressed the remaining ministers, those of you who remain have my provisional trust. Spain needs stability, but also purity in its institutions. From this day forward, any foreign influence that undermines our sovereignty will be considered treason. That same afternoon, as Madrid buzzed with rumors and conflicting reports, Isabel signed her first royal decree, the annulment of her marriage to the Count of Montpensier for reasons of state and national security. The second decree recognized Fernando Carlos as the legitimate heir to the Spanish crown, despite his physical malformations. The Count was escorted to the French border that very night, stripped of his Spanish titles and possessions, with the threat of trial in absentia should he ever attempt to return. The French embassy lodged a formal protest, which was received with icy courtesy by the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, a career diplomat known for his staunch nationalism. In the weeks that followed, Isabel consolidated her power with a series of measures that skillfully balanced political firmness with gestures toward the people. She reduced taxes on basic goods, repealed restrictive press laws imposed during her father's reign, and, in a symbolic act of great impact, opened parts of the royal palace gardens to the public. But her boldest move, the one that would define her reign in the collective memory, was the official presentation of her son to the court and the people. Against all advice, Isabel refused to hide the child's malformations. In a solemn ceremony, she held him aloft before the crowd gathered in the Plaza de Oriente. "Behold your future king," she proclaimed with a powerful voice. "He is not perfect, as Spain is not perfect, but he is strong, as our people are strong, and he is honest, as his reign will be." The initial silence gave way to a murmur of astonishment, then to an ovation that echoed through Madrid's streets. The people, weary of rulers hiding their flaws behind masks of false perfection, embraced the sincerity of this revolutionary gesture. Not all were victories, however. France, humiliated by the Count's expulsion, imposed severe tariffs on Spanish goods. The Vatican, pressured by international interests, indefinitely delayed recognizing the marriage annulment. In the northern provinces, conservative groups questioned the legitimacy of a queen who repudiated her husband and ruled with advisors of dubious morality, a clear allusion to Carlos's growing influence in the court. The relationship between Isabel and Carlos evolved into a peculiar political and personal partnership. Officially, he was merely the captain of the Royal Guard, later promoted to General and Minister of War. Unofficially, he became the Queen's shadow, her closest advisor, the unrecognized protector of young Fernando Carlos. Rumors about the prince's true paternity began as whispers in the palace corridors, but soon spread to aristocratic salons and popular taverns. The physical resemblance between Carlos and the child was too striking for keen observers. The green eyes, the shape of the chin, certain gestures that could only be inherited, not learned. Isabel never confirmed nor denied these rumors. With political cunning, she allowed the speculation to linger, creating an ambiguity that served her purposes. For conservatives, Fernando Carlos remained officially a Montpensier, ensuring dynastic continuity. For the common people and liberals, he was the secret child of a forbidden love, the protagonist of a romantic tale that humanized the crown. As the young prince grew, his physical malformations proved less limiting than the physicians had predicted. With innovative treatments from England and Germany, he gained some functionality in his right arm. His legs, supported by specially designed orthopedic devices, allowed him to take his first steps at 3 years old, to the court's delight. The cleft lip, partially corrected through pioneering surgery, left a visible scar, but did not impair his speech. Isabel insisted that her son be educated alongside other children, breaking the tradition of exclusive royal tutors. This scandalous decision for some created the first generation of young aristocrats who viewed physical differences not as grounds for exclusion, but as part of human diversity. On the 5th anniversary of her ascension to the throne, Isabel faced the gravest crisis of her reign. A coalition of conservative interests, secretly backed by France and with papal blessing, sparked a rebellion in several northern provinces. The official justification, restoring dynastic legitimacy and traditional values supposedly threatened by an immoral queen. The revolt, led by Isabel's distant cousin, the Duke of Seville, threatened to plunge Spain into a new civil war. For weeks the outcome seemed uncertain. Madrid lived through moments of panic when rebel troops came within 30 kilometers of the capital. It was in this critical moment that Isabel demonstrated the resolve history would remember. Instead of fleeing south as many advised, she chose to confront the situation directly. In an unprecedented act of audacity, she requested to appear before the Cortes, bringing young Fernando Carlos, then 6 years old, with her. Before the Assembly of Deputies and Senators, many openly hostile, Isabel delivered the speech that would definitively alter the course of her reign and Spain's history. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "I come before you not as a queen, but as a Spanish mother, a mother who, like so many others in our nation, fears for her child's future. A mother who, like Spain itself, has suffered humiliations, been betrayed by those who should have protected her, and has had to find within herself the strength to rise." The chamber was utterly silent. Fernando Carlos, standing beside his mother, faced the gazes with a dignity beyond his years. "My son was born imperfect, as our homeland is imperfect. He bears visible scars, as our history bears scars. But every day he strives to overcome his limitations, as every honest Spaniard does. And I ask myself, what example would I set for my son? What example would I set for Spain, if I were to flee at the first storm?" Isabel paused dramatically, scanning the faces before her. "Ladies and gentlemen, you may withdraw your support, you may even strip me of the crown. But as long as I have breath, I will defend my son's right to grow up in a Spain free from foreign influence, in a Spain where people are judged not by their imperfections, but by the nobility of their actions." The speech continued for nearly an hour. Isabel outlined a program of reforms that balanced tradition and progress, respect for the church and openness to new European currents of thought, defense of the monarchy and recognition of civic liberties. When she concluded, the applause was deafening, even among her former detractors. That same night, the Cortes voted overwhelmingly to support the Queen against the rebels. Extraordinary funds were mobilized for the loyal army, and even former opponents offered their services and resources. Carlos, leading the royalist troops, proved a brilliant strategist. In just 3 weeks, the rebellion was crushed. The Duke of Seville, captured while attempting to flee to France, was tried for treason but pardoned by Isabel in a calculated act of clemency that bolstered her international prestige. The military victory definitively consolidated Isabel's reign. France, recognizing the new reality, gradually withdrew support from destabilizing elements. The Vatican, ever pragmatic, finally recognized the marriage annulment. In an unexpected twist, the Count of Montpensier, fallen from grace in his own country after the failure of his Spanish ambitions, formally renounced any claim over Fernando Carlos in exchange for a lifetime pension. The years that followed were of relative peace and prosperity. Advised by capable ministers and with Carlos's steadfast support, Isabel embarked on a cautious modernization program. Railways were built, education was reformed, and national industry was promoted without entirely breaking with the traditional structures still deeply rooted in much of the country. Fernando Carlos, defying all medical expectations, grew into a young prince admired for his intelligence and sensitivity. His physical limitations, far from weakening him, forged a resilient character and an uncommon empathy for a royal heir. His education, far more open to the world than that of previous royal generations, prepared him to understand the profound changes sweeping Europe. As for Isabel and Carlos, their relationship evolved into a bond so profound it transcended conventional categories. They could never marry officially. Politics and state conveniences made it impossible. But everyone in the court knew they shared far more than governmental responsibilities. The final words Isabel wrote in her personal diary, discovered after her death many years later, encapsulated the paradox of her existence. I was sold as a slave and found freedom in captivity. I was a queen by birth, but had to conquer my crown. I was the mother of an imperfect child who taught me the perfection of unconditional love. And I loved a man I could never join before the altar, yet to whom I was bound by ties stronger than any sacrament. Life made me a slave of royal blood, but in the end, it was I who forged my own chains, and with them, Spain's freedom. Isabel's reign marked the beginning of a new era in Spanish history, one of contradictions and advances, tensions between tradition and modernity, but also of growing national autonomy in the face of foreign pressures. And young Fernando Carlos, the child born with malformations that should have condemned him to obscurity, would eventually become one of the most respected monarchs of his time, known for his wisdom and profound understanding of human dignity. The enslaved princess, against all odds, had transformed her prison into a throne. From that throne of thorns, she had forever changed the destiny of Spain.